human sacrifices, protection rituals against zombie Vikings, and horrific methods of torment and execution. These are some of the creepiest Viking traditions. Now, Vikings didn't have a super long list of torment methods when compared to, say, medieval England, but there are descriptions in a few Viking sagas which were pretty brutal. One was referred to as the Fatal Walk. Here, an incision would be made down the victim's belly, then a bit of intestine would be pulled out and either held by the tormentor or attached to a tree. Then the victim would be forced to walk around the tree over and over as their intestines were slowly pulled out of them, wrapping around the tree as they walked. Obviously, they'd eventually die. Now, it's hard to say if this really did happen the way it was described, or if there's a bit of fantasy worked in here. I mean, you can survive for hours apparently with your intestines removed, but the pain, the shock, the fact that they weren't really using the type of medical precision we have today, it seems pretty unbelievable that someone could have really gotten onto their feet in this state and done the Fatal Walk, but who knows? Man, that is gruesome though. Another sick method of execution mentioned in ancient literature is the hung meat ritual. Might want to hold on to your heels for this one. Do you cringe when you see people's Achilles tendon being sliced in action movies? Well, get ready for this, because the Viking hung meat execution method involved hanging victims upside down from their heels. Not by tying a rope around someone's heels though, but through them. They'd cut holes into the victim's heels behind the tendons and then pull the rope through the holes before hoisting them up into the air, leaving them hanging upside down. Horrific, painful, and deadly. They'd leave the victims hanging until all the blood rushed down, pooling in the upper parts of the body, eventually leading to death. A slave heading into the afterlife with their deceased master is something seen in more than one ancient culture. This happened in ancient Egypt all the time, for example, but the Vikings took things to a whole other level. So high-ranking members of Viking society were often burned on ships, along with important items like weapons, animal sacrifices, expensive clothing and jewelry, and in some cases their slave women, who would be sacrificed in order to continue serving her master in the afterlife. But this wasn't a quick process. First, she'd be dressed in fancy clothing, she'd also be kept intoxicated before having to sleep with pretty much every man in the village. After that, she'd walk onto the ship where the corpse of her chief lay, and then the men who had slept with her would finally kill her before the ship was set on fire, completing the ritual. The holmgang was a common tradition in the Viking Age. It was a way to formally settle disputes through violence, of course. In Viking society, justice was carried out a lot differently than it is today in our legal systems. Certain actions, like insulting someone of a higher class, was strictly forbidden, but killing someone wasn't always unlawful. The holmgang was a method of settling disputes through combat, a duel initiated by one individual against another who they believed had wronged them. The challenge had to be met within a week, and if the challenged person couldn't or wouldn't fight, they were automatically deemed guilty. Now, before the duel, the challenger would outline the rules, which would vary depending on the region. The rules covered the choice of weapons, the conditions for victory, and the compensation for the winner. Sometimes a holmgang would simply be a fight to the death. In cases of severe accusations, anyone from any social class could legally kill the condemned person if they failed to participate in the duel without facing any consequences. So even a slave could lawfully kill a clan leader if they committed a worse enough crime and refused to participate in a holmgang. We've all heard of Viking ship burials before, but there's a much creepier form of burial that we don't hear about often when it comes to Vikings: bog burials. What is a bog burial? Pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a corpse that was buried in a bog. What ends up happening though is the bodies kind of get mummified, in that they're kind of well preserved and incredibly creepy. The skin becomes pure black, and with all the moisture they shrivel up, which makes them look kind of like raisins. Bog bodies aren't unique to Viking Age Scandinavia. They've been found in different parts of Europe, but in the case of the Vikings, they may have buried some of their dead in bogs intentionally, possibly sacrificially, or as a form of punishment. One story goes that King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark drowned the Norwegian queen Gunhild in a bog after tricking her into coming to Denmark with the promise of a marriage alliance. There have also been a number of Viking Age bog bodies found with pretty bad wounds and pretty dramatic and painful deaths. So some historians think this could be evidence of this type of burial being reserved for terrible criminals or unhonorable members of society. Which in the Viking Age, I guess, was kind of the same thing. Vikings weren't sacrificing humans constantly or anything, but it was known to happen on occasion, like the 81 sacrifices that would happen every once in a while at the beginning of spring. In Uppsala, Sweden, there was a ritual that took place every 9 years, kicking off at the start of spring. This event spanned 9 days, with each day marked by feasting and sacrifices. Each day of the ritual involved 9 sacrifices, 1 human and 8 animals, all male. These offerings were made to honor Odin, to seek his favor for the coming year. The bodies of the sacrificed were then hung from trees with then a sacred grove beside the temple where the ritual happened. The sacrificial victims were usually criminals or slaves, people who were considered expendable, but there are accounts of even kings being sacrificed in especially desperate times, usually during famine. One of the coolest Viking warrior factions were the Berserkers, of course. They were said to be absolutely brutal in battle and seemed to possess this otherworldly power, as if they were somehow superhuman. To become a Berserker, you need to take on a transformation of sorts, though. The term Berserker comes from the Old Norse words for bear shirt. Standard Berserkers wore bear skins into battle. You also had Ulfendar. These were another group of warriors who took on more wolf-like behavior and, of course, wore wolf hides. These warriors fought with this primal intensity. Sometimes they'd even ditch axes and shields and just use their bare hands and teeth in battle, apparently. There are legends of berserkers and Ulfendar feeling no pain and continuing to fight even when severely wounded. So, how did they manage to get into this superhuman, frenzied state? They typically start by living in the wilderness, emulating the behaviors of their chosen animal totem, a bear or wolf. They'd strip themselves of their human qualities in order to supposedly imbue themselves with the strength and the ferocity of the animals. Before battle, they'd also perform ritual weapons dances and fasting. The goal was to enter into an almost trance-like state where they lost their sense of pain, allowing them to fight with this reckless abandon. They also may have been using some psychedelics in order to get into their trance-like states, mushrooms or poisonous fungi. If the dead weren't being cremated, Vikings believed there was a chance the corpse could come back as a draugr. In Viking Age folklore, the draugr was kind of what we might call a zombie today. The belief was that after a person was buried, their corpse could come back to life in some form, but their behavior determined whether they were simply a normal corpse or a draugr. A corpse could reanimate as a haugbui, which was a relatively benign undead being, sitting peacefully in its burial ground, guarding the treasures that were buried with it. As long as you didn't try to rob its grave, you'd probably be fine. On the other hand, though, you had the draugr, which was far more malevolent. These reanimated corpses would actually come out of their burial mounds and try to attack the living. And you didn't want that. So precautions needed to be taken during burial rituals. Open scissors were laid across the chest, not exactly sure what this would have done to help, but I'm sure there was some significance to it. The big toes of the deceased were often tied together, and nails were driven into the soles of the feet to keep them from, getting up. That's more understandable. It was believed that the dead could only return by retracing their steps as well, so precautions were taken to confuse them. For example, the body would be carried out feet first to try and disorient it. Next up, we have blot sacrifices. Now, these very rarely involved sacrificing humans. It was almost always animals. Again, these were sacrifices to the gods. They'd be held on the chief's estate. These ceremonies would happen 4 times a year, around winter solstice, spring equinox, summer solstice, and autumn equinox. Animals like horses and pigs were often slaughtered on stone altars. Then their BLOOD would be sprayed around everywhere onto the walls of the temple and the people. The red stuff from these sacrificed animals would even be collected in bowls and passed around for people to take a sip from. And then the good part, the meat of the animals would be cooked and feasted on. There would also be tons of drinking. And finally, we have the BLOOD eagle. Couldn't do a list like this without talking about this one. What would you do if a king threw your father into a pit of live snakes and then watched as they smothered and bit him, watching him writhe in pain until he finally died? Well, if you were a Viking back in the day, you'd probably sack the whole village and inflict an even worse punishment on the man who took the life of your father. Well, in 867 AD, that man was Aella, king of Northumbria, and his punishment was the BLOOD eagle, at the hands of Ivar the Boneless, son of Ragnar Lothbrok. So here's what Ivar is said to have done to this despicable king. Aella was restrained, laying face down on the ground. Then the image of an eagle with its wings spread out was carved into his back. Then each of his ribs were separated from the spine and splayed out. You can, kind of start to see why this was called a eagle. Next, salt was rubbed into the wound, and to finish off the piece, his lungs were pulled out and splayed over the exposed ribs, fluttering in the wind like a bird's wings. This was apparently a very rare method of execution, but it was reserved for the worst of the worst. With all that said, I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.